All right, so welcome to this particular episode of our series, The Calling, The Life, and The Word. And it really interests me to bring you this episode because ever since we came up with this particular series, I've been thinking about it for a long time, and I love it. So for this series, it's into three parts. We're talking about the calling, the life, and the worth. So today's one will be on the calling. So I'll start by defining what calling is and some misconceptions about calling. Then we'll look at some popular definitions by some theologians and some apologists. Then we'll look at certain Greek and Latin rendition. Then two types of calling. That'll be that for today's session. So let's start with this. Calling is God's divine invitation for us to live a life according to His purpose. So a calling is God's divine invitation given to us to live according to His purpose. Now, let me clear this first misconception. It's that a calling is not really about going into ministry. Most of us think that when somebody is called by God, is going into ministry, to being an apostle or an evangelist or a bishop or something like that. So let's know that calling is something that brings you fulfillment, and also you get to know that you are working in God's plan for your life. So calling is bigger than ministry. Calling is bigger than just your career. Let's quote from this popular theologian, Tim Keller, a theologian and an apologist. He says that a calling is simply God's assignment for your life. So we can summarize calling as God's assignment for your life. So ask yourself, what is God's assignment really for my life? This is just a food for thought. Now, he continued to say that it is what you were made for. And when you discover it, you find deep joy and fulfillment in it. So God's calling is what you were made for, and that when you discover it, you find deep fulfillment and joy in it, which means that we can link purpose to joy, and we can link joy to fulfillment, in that when you locate your assignment or your purpose on this earth, it brings you joy and it enables you to fulfill it. All right, so let's look at certain Greek and Latin rendition. So in Greek, the word calling that we want to use for this particular episode is klesis. Klesis means divine invitation, as used in a sense of calling for salvation, or purpose. So when somebody is being called unto salvation, the Greek rendition there is klesis. Now, for the Latin rendition, it's called vocatio. Vocatio is to be summoned to a purpose. That's like your vocation, your career, your profession. That's the Latin rendition. And the Hebrew rendition is kara. Kara is to call out by name or to summon somebody by name. So later in this series, we'll look at certain people in the Bible who God really called by name, and certain people in the Bible who worked in their assignment, not really into full-time ministry or not really into anything that has to do with preaching the word. All right. So there are two main types of calling I'll be looking at in this particular episode. We'll look at the general calling as believers and also some specific callings. So let's start with the general calling. We are saying that the general calling of God is the universal call that God extends to us all as believers. So every single one of us, if you're a believer, you've been called to be a believer. You've been called as a believer. That's one general calling that we've all received. Anyone who is not born again to, or who is not a believer to, God is calling out unto you to become a believer or to become a Christian. So that's one general calling that we all have. Now we'll look at certain aspects of this general call, and then we'll pick it up from there. And the first one is we being called unto salvation. You can get it from John 3:16, where it says that for God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in Him will not perish but have everlasting life. Which means that we've been called unto living an everlasting life. We've been called unto salvation. Other scripture backing that will be 2 Peter 3 verse 6 or Matthew 11 verse 28. So each and every believer has been called unto salvation. That's a general calling that we all have. Then the next thing is we being called unto fellowship or relationship. So God has called us to have a relationship with Him. God has called us to have a fellowship with Him. What do I mean by this? When God met the first disciple, He said that, come and I'll make you fishers of men. So God called them to come and follow Him, Jesus. Then He will make them fishers of men. So which means that our first calling is to come to be with Jesus. Then He makes us to walk in our specific callings as well. So don't forget that as well. And also, our next calling is a call unto holiness and righteous living from 1 Thessalonians 4:7. That we all been called to live a righteous life. We have all been called to live a holy life as well. So that's a very general call that we've all been called on to. And also, next, we've been called to serve others from Matthew 22 verse 37, knowing that each and every one of us have been called to serve ourselves in the service of the Lord. Also, we've been called to spread the gospel from Acts 1:8, Matthew 28 verse 19 to 20. We've all been called to preach the gospel in every medium, in every way possible. And lastly, we've been called to the glory of God. So which means that whatever life that we live here, we've been called to also live it out to bring praise and glory unto God. Now, these and many more are the general callings that we've been called as Christians. So know that as well. And this and many more can be your yardstick that you live your life with. Being called unto salvation, being called unto fellowship, being called unto holiness and righteous living, being called to serve others, being called to spread the gospel, being called to the glory of God. Now let's go into the specific calling. Now we would explain this as God's personal and unique plan for any individual. So as an individual, God has a specific and a definite and a unique plan for you. In the Bible, we get to know that in Jeremiah, that God said that he has a plan for us, a plan to prosper, a plan to make us good, a plan of hope, which means that each and every individual has a plan that's from God. God has a unique plan for that person. And so this calling or this specific plan most often is tied with our talent, is tied with our abilities, and is tied with our divine purpose. So aside you fulfilling the general plan of God for your life, ensure that you know that specific plan, that unique purpose that God has for you. And know that God has an assignment for every single one. You are not useless, you are not aimless. God has a plan for you. So after getting born again, one of the main things you have to discover is God's specific plan and God's specific purpose for you. So subsequently, we'll be looking at biblical examples like the life of Jeremiah, the life of David, the life of Moses, Isaiah, Bezalel, the life of Joseph, Paul, Nehemiah, Esther, Lydia, and many others. So we bring this episode to an end. Hope you like it. Make sure that you subscribe, you share, you comment, and you like. See you.